July 1944, a hedgerow in Normandy, 2 kilometers south of Saint-Lô. The crew of a German 75 mm Pak 40 anti-tank gun has been in this position for 9 hours. They have dug the trails into the embankment. They have cut the branches above the muzzle to give the gun a clear lane down a dirt track. They have stacked 30 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition in the slit trench behind the breach. They are veterans. They know what they're doing. At about 3 hours in the afternoon, an American Sherman tank from the 3rd Armored Division noses its way around the bend of the lane. The Pak 40 fires 1 round. The shell penetrates the right side of the Sherman just below the turret ring. The tank stops. Smoke begins to pour from the hatches. 2 of the crew climb out. The other 3 do not. The Pak 40 crew waits. This is the moment when, in everything they have been trained for, in everything they have experienced from Russia to Italy, to the hedgerows of Calvados, they are supposed to displace. Pull the gun back. Move to the alternate position. Disappear. They do not get the chance. Within roughly 4 minutes, the time it takes to limber the gun and hook it to a half-track, 2 American P-47 Thunderbolts come in low from the northwest. The first one drops a 500 lb bomb on the lane. The second strafes the hedgerow with 850 caliber machine guns. When American infantry move up to the position 30 minutes later, they find the gun. They find the ammunition. They find what is left of the crew. And here is the thing that should disturb you. This was not a fluke. This happened over and over and over again across the summer of 1944. German anti-tank crews would set up positions that, by every principle of doctrine they had inherited from World War I and refined through 5 years of combat, should have been undetectable. The Pak 40 used smokeless, low-flash powder, specifically so its muzzle blast would be hard to spot. The gun sat low, just over 1 meter tall at the shield. Crews chose positions in hedgerows and tree lines in the corners of stone barns. They were the best in the world at this, and the Americans found them every time. German interrogation records from late 1944 use a particular word again and again when crews describe what happened to them. The word is unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. They could understand being outnumbered. They could understand being outgunned. What they could not understand was how the moment they fired the first shell, something would come out of the sky for them. Some German officers thought the Americans had secret electronic equipment. Some thought the French resistance was signaling positions from the ground. Some thought there were traitors inside the Wehrmacht. The men who survived the war and wrote memoirs would still puzzle over it decades later. They'd been beaten by something they could feel but never quite see. This is the story of what was actually finding them. To explain it, we need to go back to a problem that no army on earth had solved before 1944, and to a small group of Americans who solved it by ignoring almost every rule about how an army was supposed to work. Before we can understand how those guns kept getting found, we have to understand why their crews were so confident they would not be. Because confidence is the right word. The German anti-tank service in 1944 was not paranoid. It was not fearful. The men sitting behind those split trail carriages believed with good reason that they had the best job in the Wehrmacht. The Pak 40 was the gun the German army built after the shock of Operation Barbarossa, when the older Pak 38 had failed against Soviet T-34s. Production began in 1942. By the time Allied forces hit the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, more than 23,000 Pak 40s had been manufactured. It was the standard German anti-tank weapon on every front. Captured guns served in the Red Army, in Finland, in post-war conflicts as late as Vietnam. The numbers were unforgiving. A Pak 40 firing standard armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate roughly 120 millimeters of armor at 500 mm. The frontal armor of an M4 Sherman was 51 mm. The math meant that a Sherman crew, no matter how brave, no matter how well trained, was in lethal danger from the moment a Pak 40 had it in its sights at any reasonable battlefield range. The rate of fire was 14 rounds a minute. The crew was 6 men. The doctrine for using the gun was equally well thought out. Pak 40 batteries did not advance with attacking troops. They were defensive weapons. They were sighted on likely tank approach routes, roads, lanes, breaks in the hedgerows with overlapping fields of fire. They were dug in low so that only the gun shield showed above ground. The shields themselves were sloped, painted in the late war ambush camouflage of beige, green, and red-brown. The barrels were often draped with cut branches or hay. And here is the detail that mattered most, the powder. German anti-tank guns in 1944 used a propellant specifically engineered to produce minimal muzzle flash and minimal smoke. American tankers who fought them have written about this in their memoirs for 80 years. You did not see a POW-40 fire. You saw your friend's tank stop, and you heard the round hit. The shell could arrive before the sound of the gun did. The first sign that a position existed was a Sherman with a hole in it. There were crews so good at this that they became famous within their own divisions. The hedgerow country itself made the situation worse for the Americans. The bocage of Calvados, the dense ancient earth and vegetation walls that divided every field from every other field, created a defensive landscape that the Germans simply moved into and occupied. Every hedgerow corner was a potential gun position. Every road junction was an interlocking field of fire. American tanks that crossed an open field could expect to be hit before they reached the far side. The British military theorist J.F.C. Fuller, writing about Normandy after the war, described the bocage as one of the most defensible pieces of terrain any modern army had ever encountered. The German crews knew all of this. They knew the math. They knew their doctrine. They knew their ground. And in the early weeks of the Normandy campaign, the math worked. American armored battalions took catastrophic losses to hidden anti-tank fire. Whole tank companies were destroyed in single afternoons. By late June, the 3rd Armored Division had reported casualty rates in its lead Sherman companies approaching 70%. The Allied breakout was 3 weeks behind schedule and falling further behind every day. And then something began to change. It did not change all at once. It did not change because of any single battle. It changed in a way that, from the German side, looked like luck. Except that the luck kept happening until the men behind the gun shields began to understand that whatever was finding them was not luck at all. What changed first was nothing the Germans could see. It was a small, unarmed, fabric-covered airplane painted olive drab, flying at about 90 mph 2,000 ft above the front. There were dozens of them. They were the slowest combat aircraft on the battlefield. The Germans called them little flies and shot at them with everything they had. 80 8mm flat guns, machine guns, even rifles. Not many of the flies were knocked down. The ones that survived a single combat mission were valuable beyond reckoning. Because what those airplanes were doing was changing what it meant to fire a gun in a hedgerow. The German anti-tank crews who fought in Normandy did not know what they were looking at when they squinted up at one of those airplanes. They were looking at the answer to the mystery. They just could not see the full machine yet. To understand why, you have to understand what those little flies actually were, who flew them, and what they had in their cockpits that no other army on Earth had managed to put there. The airplane was a Piper L4 Grasshopper. It was the military version of the Piper J3 Cub, the small yellow trainer that thousands of Americans had learned to fly in during the 1930s. Strip the chrome yellow paint, slap on a coat of olive drab, cut some plexiglass windows into the rear fuselage so the backseat passenger could see straight down. And you had the United States Army's answer to a problem nobody else had quite figured out how to solve. The problem was simple to state and brutally hard to solve. Modern artillery by 1944 was so accurate and so devastating that the limiting factor was no longer the guns. It was the eyes. Whoever could see the target could kill it. The trouble was that the front lines of a major war were vast. The American sector in Normandy alone covered dozens of miles, and human beings on the ground could see only a few hundred yards in any direction. Less in country like the bocage. The Germans had thought about this problem. They had Fieseler Storch liaison aircraft, which were beautiful machines, but the Luftwaffe controlled them. The Wehrmacht had to request them. And by mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had been so chewed up that the Storch barely flew over Normandy at all. What the Americans had done that no other army had managed was put the airplanes inside the artillery itself. The Field Artillery Branch, not the Army Air Forces, owned the L4s. Every artillery battalion in the United States Army was authorized 2 of them, with 2 pilots and 1 mechanic. The pilots were field artillery officers, not pilots loaned from the Air Force, but artillerymen who'd been taught to fly. They understood guns from the inside. They knew how a fire mission worked. When they radioed a correction to a battery on the ground, they were speaking the same language as the men putting the rounds down range. By the summer of 1944, more than 2,700 L-4s served with American forces in Europe. Some 900 of them were lost in action or in accidents. The men who flew them developed a particular kind of nerve. Captain John Johnson, who flew an L-4 with the 12th Corps Artillery in Patton's Third Army, would later describe a war fought at 200 miles above the ground in an unarmored airplane built of welded steel tube and Irish linen. Most of the time when the Germans saw him, they shot at him with 88 mm flak. The fuse on an 88 round was set to explode at altitude. If it went off close, the Cub disintegrated. Johnson and his fellow pilots developed evasive flying that involved diving sharply, slewing the airplane sideways, and using the natural folds of the Normandy ground as cover. Bruce Gale, another L-4 pilot, eventually installed homemade bazooka rails under his wing struts. They were not officially approved. He felt that they gave him a fighting chance against the anti-aircraft guns that hunted him. The most famous of all the L-4 pilots was Charles Carpenter, a former history teacher from Illinois. 29 years old when he enlisted, assigned to the 4th Armored Division. Carpenter's reputation in his division was that he would do anything. He bolted 6 bazookas to the wing struts of his Cub. He named the airplane Rosie the Rocketer. He used it to attack German armored vehicles directly, diving at angles approaching 80 degrees and pulling out at 1,500 Arftonor. Documented reports from the 4th Armored Division, credited with disabling multiple German tanks and armored cars during the campaign across France. His superiors did not officially encourage what he was doing. They did not stop him either. This is the place where it is worth pausing, because the story of the L-4 is not the story of one pilot strapping bazookas to a trainer. The story is what the airplane allowed the system to do. When a POC-40 fired its first round in a hedgerow, the muzzle blast, even with low flash powder, produced a small disturbance. Dust lifted. Smoke drifted for a few seconds. Branches shifted from the recoil. None of this would be visible to a tank commander, buttoned up in a Sherman 500 wide away. But it was visible from above at 2,000 FT to a man with a pair of binoculars and a coordinate map. And the moment that man had the coordinates, he could speak into a radio. What happened next depended on a system that took American artillery doctrine and made it operate at the speed of war. The Fire Direction Center. The doctrine inherited from the work done at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in the 1930s. A single radio call could mask the fire of multiple battalions onto a single target inside of 3 to 4 minutes. From the German gun crew's perspective, they had fired one shell. From the American perspective, that one shell told them everything. Roughly a third of the answer lives here. The eyes were not on ground, they were 2,000 TD up, and the men flying them were artillery men first and pilots second, which meant they did not have to translate what they were seeing into another service's vocabulary. They knew exactly what coordinates to send because they had been trained to send them. But there was a problem with the L-4 system, and German crews who survived their first encounter with it began at first dimly to understand what it was. Artillery takes minutes. An L-4 could call in a fire mission in 3 or 4 minutes. A skilled POC-40 crew could hook up, displace, and be moving in less than that. The geometry of the chase had been changed, but it had not been finished. Something else was needed to close the last gap. Something that could put a weapon on top of a hidden gun within seconds, not minutes. That something was sitting in a Quonset hut in southern England in early 1944, being argued about by a brigadier general named Pete Casada and an Army group commander named Omar Bradley. What they were about to propose had never been done before in the history of warfare. His name was Elwood Richard Casada. Almost nobody called him that. To his friends and to the men who served under him, he was Pete. By the spring of 1944, he'd been promoted to Major General and given command of the 9th Tactical Air Command, the fighter-bomber arm of the 9th Air Force, the air component that would support the American First Army in the upcoming invasion of France. Quesada was an unusual figure inside the Army Air Forces. The Air Forces in 1944 were dominated culturally and doctrinally by the strategic bomber crowd. The men who believed that the way to win the war was to put 1,000 bomber raids over Berlin and Hamburg and Schweinfurt. Close air support, the dirty low-altitude work of dropping bombs and firing rockets in support of soldiers on the ground, was considered by many of those men a misuse of expensive aircraft. The pre-war Air Corps had been arguing for almost a decade that the future of air power was independent, strategic bombing, not tactical support of armies. Quesada thought this was nonsense. He believed at his core that an air force which could not directly help the men dying in the dirt below, it was an air force that had forgotten what it was for. He flew into Normandy the day after D-Day and set up his headquarters next to Omar Bradley's 1st Army command post. Bradley, for his part, was famously dismissive of the kind of pilots with silk scarves, attitude he had encountered in earlier campaigns. He liked Quesada immediately. What Quesada saw in the first weeks of the Normandy fighting was a war in which the ground forces and the air forces were fighting two parallel battles. The fighter-bomber pilots would take off from England with general target lists. They would fly across the Channel, find what they could find, and drop their ordnance on it. The Sherman Company was being eaten alive by hidden anti-tank guns at exactly the moment a flight of P-47s flew overhead. The pilots usually did not know. There was no way for them to know. There was no shared radio. There was no shared map reference. The pilots talked to other pilots. The tankers talked to other tankers. The two services were physically in the same airspace in the same battlefield, and they were tactically deaf to each other. In late June or early July of 1944, the exact date is debated by historians, Quesada went to Bradley with a proposal. The proposal would have horrified almost every senior officer in either service if presented through normal channels. Quesada wanted to take a VHF radio set out of a P-47 Thunderbolt, specifically the SCR-5182 set, the standard set for American single-engine fighters, and bolt it into the turret of an M4 Sherman tank. He wanted to put a fighter pilot in flight gear inside that tank, and he wanted that pilot, riding in the lead tank of an armored column, to be able to talk directly to other pilots flying P-47s overhead in the same vocabulary, on the same frequency, in real time. Bradley, by every account that survives of the meeting, agreed almost on the spot. 2 M4 Shermans were sent to 9th IAC headquarters within hours for the modification. By the end of July 1944, the system had a name. It was called Armored Column Cover. Here is how it worked in practice. A combat command of an American Armored Division, say Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division, would have 3 air support parties. One rode with the division commander. The 2 others rode with the combat commands. Each party included an air liaison officer, almost always a fighter pilot from the Army Air Forces, who rode inside a specially modified Sherman tank. The tank had 2 radios. One was the standard SCR-528 tank-to-tank radio that the tank commander used to talk to his platoon. The other was the SCR-522, pulled directly out of a P-47 that the air liaison officer used to talk to the fighter-bomber flight orbiting somewhere above. A flight of 4 P-47s would fly above the armored column, typically at $5,000 to $7,000 FUM, low enough to see the ground clearly, high enough to be relatively safe from light flak. When the column came under fire, the air liaison officer in the lead Sherman would radio the flight leader. He would describe the target. He would, if necessary, fire a round of colored smoke from a mortar in the direction of the German position. The flight leader would peel off, identify the smoke, and roll in. From the German anti-tank crew's perspective, the timing was no longer survivable. The fire and displace doctrine assumed several minutes between firing and consequence. Quesada's system collapsed that interval down to seconds. The first shell told the Sherman where the gun was. The Sherman told the P-47. The P-47 was already on top of them. Quesada's own description of what he had built was characteristically blunt. According to his biographer, Thomas Alexander Hughes, he told Bradley that this arrangement would put ground-to-air direction in language the fighter boy in the air can understand. This was the entire point, not a translation through layers of intermediaries, not a request passed through 3 radio nets in a Corps headquarters. A pilot in a tank talking to a pilot in a plane, both of them looking at the same German gun from different angles. The Germans did not have a comparable system. To understand why is to understand something fundamental about how the two militaries differed. The Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe were separate services with separate command structures and a long history of bureaucratic rivalry. Putting a Luftwaffe pilot inside a Wehrmacht tank with a Luftwaffe radio on a Luftwaffe frequency would have required signed orders from people who did not get along. By the time anything could have been agreed upon, the Luftwaffe over Normandy was effectively dead. The American system worked because Quesada and Bradley operated in a culture that allowed them to bypass official channels. Two Shermans, one casual conversation, one decision that did not go through Washington, and 3 weeks later, the system was operating across the entire First Army front. By the time the breakout from Normandy began on July 25, 1944, every American armored division had air support parties of this kind. The German crews behind their PAC-40s did not know it yet, but the math of the hedgerow had just been rewritten in a way that would not be reversed. What it looked like when the new math arrived at full strength is a thing best told through the experience of one specific German formation in one specific place over a few specific days at the end of July 1944. The place was called Rancy. At 9:40 in the morning on July 25, 1944, the largest tactical air bombardment of the European war began. Approximately 1,500 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers, with another 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers in support, dropped roughly 3,300 tons of bombs on a strip of Normandy countryside about 3 miles wide and 1 mile deep, just west of St. Lo. The target was the Panzer Lehr Division, the elite German Armor Training Division, transferred to Normandy and ordered to hold the line against the American breakout. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, the division commander, described what happened in post-war interrogations. His entire division was reduced to what he called a Munlandschaft, a moonscape, within 90 minutes. Craters touching rim to rim, all signal communications cut. Several of his men, he reported, went mad and ran out into the open until shrapnel killed them. This is the part of the Cobra story that is usually told. The carpet bombing breaks the line, the American breakout begins. It is true, but it is not the part that answers our question. The carpet bombing happened once. The thing that destroyed the PAC-40 crews happened every day for the next 2 weeks in a way the men dying inside it found incomprehensible. By July 28th, 3 days after the carpet bombing, the German front in the western half of Normandy had not just been broken, it had been disintegrated. 6 German divisions, or what remained of them, found themselves caught in a pocket south of Coutances, centered on the village of Rancy. They were trying to retreat eastward before the trap closed. To do that, they had to move on roads. They had to move during daylight because moving at night was too slow. They had no Luftwaffe cover. And waiting for them, orbiting 2,000 FT above the road network, were the air liaison parties of the American 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, talking on SCR 522 radios to flights of P-47 Thunderbolts that had been on station since dawn. What followed on the afternoon and evening of July 29th is one of the most concentrated demonstrations of air-ground integration in the history of warfare. Around the village of Rancy, on a single column trying to break out, the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 405th Fighter Group destroyed a documented 122 tanks, 259 other vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces. RAF Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, called in by the same network, flew 99 sorties in the same area and claimed 17 more tanks destroyed. By the time the pocket was reduced on July 30th, more than 7,500 German troops had been killed or captured. More than 250 vehicles and over 100 tanks lay destroyed or abandoned on the roads. A young officer of the 2nd SS Panzer Division des Reich named Fritz Langenke, 25 years old, a veteran of 7 years in the SS, lived through Rancy and gave a detailed interview about it years later for World War II magazine. Langenke commanded a platoon of 4 Panthers attached to the reinforced 3rd Battalion of SS Regiment Deutschland. His description of the breakout attempt is the description of a man trying to escape from inside a system he could not see the edges of. The roads were burning. Vehicles in front exploded for reasons that did not always involve any visible attacker. When his column tried to detour onto smaller lanes, those lanes had been hit. When it tried to move at night, daylight came, and the lanes were hit again. Langenke survived. Most of the men around him did not. The diary of a flak unit attached to the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, captured intact after the battle, describes the same situation from another angle. The text was translated and published by historian Richard Hargreaves. Wild confusion in all units. Roads clogged with vehicles. heavy losses caused by Jabot attacks since we have to move by daylight to escape encirclement. Jabo, short for Jagbomber, hunter bomber, was the universal Wehrmacht word for the American P-47 and the British Typhoon. By the diary's description, the entire valley appeared to be on fire, with thick columns of smoke rising from shot-up vehicles and ammunition cooking off inside them. Now here is the question worth pausing on. Why could the Germans not adapt? They had survived bombing in Russia. They had survived Allied air superiority in Italy. The German army was famously good at improvisation under pressure. Why in Normandy in the summer of 1944 did they have no answer? Part of the answer is that the Luftwaffe was essentially gone. By July 1944, Allied fighter strength had so dominated the skies that German fighter pilots simply could not contest them at the scale required. Part of the answer is fuel. The Luftwaffe had run short of high-octane aviation gasoline because of Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants. But those are explanations for why the Germans could not shoot down the P-47s. They do not explain why the Germans could not build their own version of the system. The deeper answer is institutional. The German command system in 1944 was paradoxically more centralized and more rigid than the American system at the same level. Adolf Hitler, at his headquarters in East Prussia, was making operational decisions about formations as small as battalions. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, did not have the authority to redeploy panzer reserves without permission. By contrast, two American generals, one Air Force, one Army, had agreed in a tent in Normandy to bolt fighter radios into tanks and had it operating within weeks. Quesada did not ask Washington. Bradley did not ask Schaeff. They just did it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in a letter dated June 10, 1944, wrote a sentence that came to be quoted in nearly every post-war history of the campaign. Allied air superiority, he said, had a grave effect on German movements, and there was simply no answer to it. Rommel was right. There was no answer. There was no answer because the answer the Allies had built was not just airplanes. It was airplanes connected to tanks, connected to artillery through a single radio net, and you could not improvise that in 6 weeks under bombing. The destruction at Rancy was one demonstration. It was not the largest. By the second week of August 1944, the entire German army in Normandy was retreating eastward, trying to escape an encirclement at the town of Falaise. And it was at Mortagne, in the days just before Falaise, that Adolf Hitler ordered the last serious German counterattack of the campaign, the offensive that was supposed to cut Patton's spearhead in two and reverse the breakout. What happened to that offensive is the place where the answer becomes finally complete. On August 2, 1944, Adolf Hitler ordered an immediate counterattack between the towns of Mortagne and Avranches. The goal was to drive west, cut Patton's Third Army off from its supply lines, and split the American forces in France in two. The operation was codenamed Ludic, after the German name for the Belgian city of Liege, where the Wehrmacht had won a victory in August 1914. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, by every account, thought the plan was hopeless. He suggested withdrawing to the Seine. Hitler refused. The Germans assembled what they could, roughly 300 tanks and assault guns from the 2nd Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer, the 1st SS Panzer Leibstandarte, and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and launched the attack in the early hours of August 7th. It went forward at 1 in the morning, deliberately timed to begin in darkness, so American fighter bombers could not intervene. By dawn, the leading panzer columns had pushed several kilometers into the American line. They had also walked into the worst piece of geography they could have chosen. East of the town of Mortagne rose a rocky hill 314 meters above sea level. The men of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, about 700 of them, had taken position on the summit 2 days earlier. Among them were 2 artillery forward observers from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. First Lieutenant Charles A. Bartz commanded Battery C's observation team. Second Lieutenant Robert L. Weiss, 21 years old from Indiana, the son of a Jewish immigrant from Hungary, commanded Battery B's team. According to historian Rick Atkinson's account, Weiss carried a 35 lb SCR 610 radio up to the summit and spent the previous day plotting emergency barrage numbers on a fire control map. From the top of Hill 314 on a clear morning, You could see the road network around Mortain spread out below like a battle map. Weiss and Bartz could see, in real time, every German tank, every truck, every infantry column trying to push west. When the German attack began, they began calling fire missions. 5 American artillery battalions firing on targets the gun crews behind them could not see, but 2 men on a hill could. And then, as the morning fog burned off and the sun came up, the airplanes arrived. August 7, 1944 became known in RAF squadron records as the Day of the Typhoon. Royal Air Force 121 and 124 wings of 83 Group conducted 305 sorties over the Mortain battle area, claiming 90 Panzers destroyed and 59 more damaged. American P-47 Thunderbolts of Quesada's 9th Tactical Air Command conducted approximately 400 additional sorties. 7 rocket-armed P-47s from the 406 Fighter Group alone claimed 12 to 13 Panzers destroyed using their 4.5-in M8 rockets. The numbers were disputed after the war. Post-war analysis showed that direct rocket and bomb hits on individual tanks were rarer than pilots claimed in the heat of battle. But this is one of those places where the strict counting misses what actually happened. The German tank crews did not need to be killed by direct hits to be defeated. They needed to be stopped. A column under sustained Jabot attack could not move. It could not refuel. Its supply trucks burned. Its commanders lost radio contact. Its men abandoned their vehicles and ran for the trees. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the 2nd Panzer Division, gave a post-war interrogation in which his summary of the air-ground problem was as direct as any commander has ever given. According to the interrogation transcript quoted in the World War II database, he said simply, "We could do nothing against them." Operation Ludick collapsed within 48 hours. By August 13th, the surviving German armor was being pulled back. Between August 17th and August 21st, the Flace pocket closed. Inside it, the Wehrmacht left behind by various Allied estimates. Roughly 500 tanks and assault guns, 700 towed artillery pieces, more than 5,000 motor vehicles, and 50,000 prisoners. Eisenhower, walking the battlefield afterward, said no other battlefield he had seen presented such a horrible sight of death and total destruction. Now we can give the full answer because the question was not really about anti-tank guns. It was about a particular German experience. The experience of being inside a competent, well-trained, well-equipped military formation and being beaten by something you could feel happening to you but could not explain. The answer is that the men behind the gun shields were seeing the consequences of a system, but not the system itself. They saw an airplane. They did not see that the airplane was being flown by a field artillery officer who'd been to gunnery school at Fort Sill and who was talking on a radio to a battalion fire direction center that could mass 12 batteries on a single coordinate in 3 minutes. They saw a tank. They did not see that the tank had a fighter pilot in its turret holding an SCR 522 microphone connected to a flight of P-47s orbiting at $6,000 reft. They saw rockets. They did not see that the rockets had been called in by a man named Weiss on a hill they could not capture. The German anti-tank crews of 1944 had been trained to fight a battle of weapon against weapon. What they encountered instead was a battle of system against weapon, and a better system, as the old observation goes, beats a braver army. Pete Quesada survived the war. He retired as a lieutenant general. He died in 1993, and most Americans have never heard of him. Robert Weiss came home from Hill 314, finished his education, and wrote a memoir called Fire Mission. Charles Carpenter came home, returned to teaching high school history, and died in 1966. Fritz Langenke survived the war, was interviewed by World War II magazine decades later, and tried to describe what had happened to his men at Roncy. He did his best. He could not fully explain it. That is the verdict. The German anti-tank crews could not explain what was killing them because what was killing them was not a thing. It was a network. It was a working agreement between 2 generals in a tent made functional through the labor of thousands of pilots, gunners, radio operators, and engineers. Every individual American technology in this story had a German equivalent. The PaK-40 outranged most American tank guns. The Tiger and the Panther outclassed the Sherman. The 88 outranged the L-4's evasive maneuvers. The Wehrmacht had Storch liaison aircraft. The Luftwaffe had perfectly serviceable radios. What the Germans did not have was the connections between them, and that is the lesson as far as one is allowed to draw a lesson from a story this terrible. The POC-40 in the hedgerow did not lose to a better gun. It lost to a way of thinking about how guns and airplanes and radios and tanks and forward observers could be organized into a single weapon. It lost to a system whose individual parts the crew could see and whose totality the crew could not. If this story changed the way you perceive the hidden machinery of war and the systems that define history, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the historical truths that were nearly buried in the dust of the battlefield. Help us cultivate a deeper understanding of the past. Our next historical treasure will be opened very soon.